On January the 7th of this year, Pastor Phil preached a sermon, Epiphany Sunday, and at the end of his sermon, he made this statement: God's love is breaking out all over. Are we able to observe it? He encouraged us in the weeks ahead to do just that, observe. And then he went on to explain a little bit further, what does it mean to observe? It means to be attentive, to be expectant, to be reflective. And that we really should be engaging in active watching. Well, that resonated with me because, in fact, for many years during this season, I have done just that as a spiritual practice, as a spiritual discipline, during the season of Epiphany. And for me, it is a season. Now, some traditions observe January the 6th, Epiphany, and the Sunday closest to it as Epiphany Sunday, but then they kind of pack up Epiphany with Christmas and the Advent until the following year and move into ordinary time until we get to the season of Lent. But there are other traditions who observe Epiphany and then see it as a season that continues until Lent begins. And that's what I like to do myself. To see it as an extended period of time when I am actively watching and listening for how God is being revealed. Where do I see God's love breaking out, breaking into, breaking down walls? Where does it happen? How do I see God's action and involvement in the world? Where do I see the face of Jesus in another? I don't know about you, but I need the season of Epiphany. I need a time when I am going to seek and search and hopefully find stories of light, stories of hope, stories of goodness. And in some ways, John and I symbolically do that by taking out of our windows at Christmas on Epiphany our candle that has a green light, and we put in a white light. So in our home, if you drive by late afternoon or evening, you will see in every one of our windows our candle that's white. And we will keep it there until Lent begins. Now, I want to pay attention during my season. I want to observe. I want to see, search, find stories of light and hope. How do I do that? I do it primarily in two ways. Number one is I observe. I try to hear and listen to what is being read and what it is we have for every Sunday during Epiphany that comes from our lectionary texts. Whether it's Old Testament readings or New Testament readings, what is happening in these texts that help me to have a better understanding of who God is, that helps me to see God's work, to name God's action. And so if you look at the Old Testament texts each Sunday, you hear that read or you study it at home, the Psalms particularly have all kinds of things that tell us, especially if you note the verbs, what is it that God's doing? So even the call to worship, which was part of the psalm for today, the themes, if you're looking at what are the themes and how is our understanding of God and God's character enlarged, you see that for today, God builds up. God gathers. God heals the brokenhearted. God binds up wounds names and calls the stars. God sustains the humble. God supplies the earth with what's needed, provides food, makes grass grow. God delights in those who fear him, who put their trust in him. And the Isaiah text also, God does not grow weary. God gives strength. And God increases power for the weak. So if you look at the Old Testament text, you see many times that things are named. What can God do? How is our understanding enlarged? And how are we reminded of God's provision and God's greatness? The New Testament text, no matter what year we are in during this lectionary time and the cycle, whichever one we're in, the New Testament texts begin with the Magi story from Matthew on Epiphany Sunday, and then it moves into the early life and teachings of Jesus, and we see every Sunday kind of this unfolding, this developing of who Jesus is and what is he doing on the earth. So it often begins, depending on the gospel, the baptism of Jesus by John in the Jordan. The Spirit descends upon him like a dove. And it moves to Jesus doing other things. It's his calling of his disciples, this group that's going to surround him and be with him, calling them from various walks of life for his followers to go with him. It also leaves us narratives of other things that are happening in Jesus' life. The wedding at Cana, when he changes water into wine. We see how he begins teaching, and last Sunday's text was teaching with authority. That was noted. That was important. And then we begin to see how Jesus cast out demons and evil spirits, and he began to do this amazing healing ministry. And everybody flocked to him, gathered at his door, gathered around him, came to him over and over again. So we read these stories of how God's Son began to touch people's lives and healed them physically, brought light and wholeness into bodies again. But we also see the humanity of Jesus, and that at the end of a long day of healing and ministries, he needed solitude. He needed to go off and find a place to pray so that he could continue the ministry that he was called to, preaching. And he went throughout Galilee. So how do I experience active watching? I do it by looking at the text, scripture. But I also, number 2, observe what is happening around me, in my sphere, but also beyond me during this time. And I look for stories of light and hope in this context today. Where do I see God's love breaking in, breaking out? Where do I see Jesus in the face of others? And am I sometimes called to be that light, that agent of hope to another? Now, as you know, we're in dark times. And dark in the sense that so much in the news and so much is happening around us has this element of heaviness. And so one day, a few weeks ago, I was ready to meet with my spiritual director, which I do once a month. And I was just like really frustrated. How do I see stories of light? It's like everything on the news was just not good. And I said, how do I see? Where do I find stories of light and hope? And he, in his wisdom, said, where are you looking? Where was I looking for those stories of light? It helped me to shift my direction as to where I was looking for stories of light, and it changed some things for me. Stories of light. And he added in his conversation that he himself begins to look for the resilience in people. The resilience in people. And I began to see that. And so today, I'm going to be sharing some stories of light and hope that I have found in the weeks since Phil preached the beginning of January. We already have a candle lit for nurses. Story of light. About 30 years ago, a young woman by the name of Vanessa Howard from Tampa, Florida, was a young single mother with several children. She lived on the streets or in a homeless shelter or crashed with her friends. She was a victim of domestic violence. She was really discouraged and had a lot of issues. She knew something had to change for her. But how? Through the kindness of a landlord, she was able to secure a small apartment for her and for her daughters, which was a beginning of some stability and security for her. Eventually, she went to cosmetology school, secured training as a beautician, and in 2014, she opened up her own beauty salon in Tampa, Florida. As she became stable, secure, confident, and successful, she wanted to give back. And so she and some volunteers, and now including 5 daughters of her own who were teenagers and young adults, had a vision. And so one day a month, they open up the beauty salon and they give free haircuts, manicures, pedicures, makeup sessions to women in need. Women who would not have resources to go to a beauty salon for a haircut. It has proven to be such an outreach for her that she calls it her spiritual spa days. And since 2014, she has done that for over 300 women. It's been so successful that this fall she's going to do that for young boys who are going back to school haircuts, and gives them a backpack. That's the plan. So I light a candle for Vanessa Howard of Tampa, Florida, and for many others who may be like her, who find a way to turn, who find an outreach of a landlord to get her started in a new direction and then give back to others. Resilient, resourceful, courageous people. So a light for her. Another story. A few weeks ago, 57 junior high youth and their leaders were involved in a bus accident in Colorado. They were junior high youth from 3 Mennonite churches in Kansas, and they were on their way home from a snow camp at Rocky Mountain Mennonite Camp. They got into a blizzard on Sunday morning as they were returning from Colorado to Kansas. And the bus driver saw ahead on the interstate a semi-trailer that was jackknifed in the road and was not able to stop in time. And the bus hit the truck. The bus driver suffered broken legs. Fortunately, the 57 youth and their leaders were not injured. But suddenly, this snow camp adventure over a weekend turned into something very different, where they had to spend 2 extra days in Colorado in motels, snowed in. The article that was written said that the leaders of that youth group were impressed by the patience and understanding of the youth during a very difficult time, and the compassion they showed to the bus driver who had to be hospitalized, and to him who sacrificed a fair bit in order that nothing else more seriously happened. It also took resourceful leaders, patient youth, but resourceful, creative leaders who also could manage 50-plus junior high kids in a motel for 2 nights, finding ways to keep them fed and entertained over an extended period of time. It also required someone, and it was a group from a local Methodist church in that small town where they were housed, who came providing some food for the kids' lunches and a home-cooked meal that was brought in to them. They made it back safely to Kansas, but I light a candle for the resourcefulness of leaders, the patience and understanding of youth, the hospitality and generosity of a Methodist church who saw a need during a difficult time. In recent months, many of us have heard the story over and over again of the more than 200 young girls and women who have come forward and broken the silence of being violated and abused while they were training for women's gymnastics to represent our country. You know the story. I don't need to go into the details. But I cannot imagine what that has been like for them and for their families. It took one of those women who broke the wall of silence to tell the story and make sure it was heard and provided more courage for more to come forward. So I light a candle for that first woman who came forward and for the more than 200 others who have shared their story. Courage. But I also am going to light a candle to acknowledge the pain, the scars, the memories that they will carry with them and have to work through what they experienced with their families, and will have to do that probably for the rest of their life. If I'm honest, I'll confess that I don't know what to do about my feelings for that doctor. But I'm not going to go there. Somehow, some way, God will be the judge and be a part of that process. The courage, and yes, the pain. Last July, on a Sunday morning, the Mennonite church, they were at worship. And they heard a crash. It turned out that a large branch of a 381-year-old white oak tree split and fell in the corner of their old cemetery, the Mennonite church. It was a community landmark for many. It had been there for decades, centuries actually. 381, huge white oak tree. So the next day, an arborist and a few others gathered around and can this tree be saved? And while they were there looking at the rest of the tree, it fell and crashed, and they had to run, literally, to get out of harm's way. So what to do about this tree? Certainly was a sign they couldn't resuscitate it. It wasn't going to live, but what to do about it? A few neighbors wanted some of the wood, and so people began to inquire about it. And it was happening about the same time that the church was trying to figure out what to do to connect with their neighbors, community outreach. And suddenly a few creative souls gathered together, and they came up with having a community tree day. So they canceled, changed plans, no more spaghetti dinners, no more yard sales to try to get the community in. They were going to have a community tree day. So they provided this community day where wood was given and passed out. There were Christmas tree ornaments that were made from some of the wood. A ceramist in the congregation made green ceramic mugs with the imprint of a tree, sold them. They had soup and invited the neighborhood. They made cookies in the shape of acorns and oak leaves. They told stories and brought photos, and they had a time of sharing together because this tree meant something to so many. It was like part of them had died when they saw this old tree die, break apart. And so they had this time with gathering together, worshiping, passing out acorns. And a 97-year-old member brought a neighbor brought a 3-foot sapling that he had started 6 years ago from an acorn of that tree, and brought it and they planted it in that space. And they sang and they worshiped and they told stories. And John Ruth and another historian took little walking tours through the cemetery and talked about the people that were buried there, their ancestors, how they were all there, part of this, when this tree was there. So, there's some amazing things that can happen. Resourceful, creative people, out of death, out of a dead tree, came some new life, new connections, nurturing relationships and friendships, bringing the community in a way that nothing else had ever happened. We have those kinds of examples here. You know as well as I do that over the last 10 years, we have done school kit blitz. Over the last 10 years, we have bought supplies, packed over 15,000 school kits for Mennonite Central Committee. That started with one person, Dorothy Logan, who saw the need, shared it with a few people, small group. It kind of kept growing with the Mennonite women, with leadership, with our church, and pretty soon we were doing this as an annual event. 15,000 school kits. All of these are stories of light and hope. So I light that candle for Dorothy Logan and others like her, but we know there will never be one like her. But other people who had an idea, who started, our shelters in town, our kids clubs on Thursday nights, that's an amazing vision. And it's out of something, sometimes, that's a very dark space and dark time, but somewhere we need stories of light and hope. We have on our doors, on our yards, signs that were started, and now we have those. No matter where you are from, we are glad you're our neighbor. Another story of light and hope. And over this past year, we all know that there was a huge number of natural disasters around our country and beyond. Hurricanes, mudslides, wildfires, storms. I light this last candle for all of those responders, those persons who spent all kinds of time and energy connecting power lines, cleaning up messes, shoveling out mud, putting out fires, rescuing people from rooftops, pulling them out of cars that were going down the stream, and over again. A candle for volunteers, responders, Mennonite disaster service. These are stories that are about light and hope. And so sometimes when I'm ready to go pretty deep into despair and discouragement and depression, when I'm angry and upset about what's happening politically, in our governments, in our churches sometimes, I have to keep reminding myself, this is the season of Epiphany, and I'm going to keep seeking and searching and finding stories of light and hope. Because God is the one with whom we put our trust, and God delights in us when we know and experience this unfailing love. Stories of courageous people, visionary people, resourceful people, creative people, resilient people. So I'm wondering, in this last month, have you been seeking, searching, finding stories of light and hope? You know, what candle might you identify with? Or they all look different. So these lights represent the light of Christ, the hope in the midst of dark times. So where have you seen God's love revealed? Where have you experienced it? And how might you be that light, bring that light of Christ, hold the light of Christ within your place of influence, work, life, living, family? What are you being called to do? How are you going to live in the light? Hold the light of Christ's love so that it can be a light of revelation to everyone, to all people, all nations, everywhere.